So Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Ahmadinejad were in a cab. No. There must be a joke like that out there somewhere. Anyway, I just want to thank Laura Cutler and thank the Center for Israel Studies for co-sponsoring the event. I also want to thank the International Politics Program here in SIS for co-sponsoring the event. Particularly want to thank my colleague Boaz Atzili for all the work that he did to help put this together and bring a range of different perspectives. One of our speakers is on the way, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody, the speakers now. Dr. Trita Parsi is founder and current president of the National Iranian American Council, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the interests and strengthening the voice of the Iranian American community. He's the author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States, and A Single Roll of the Dice, which was the recipient of the Council on Foreign Relations 2008 Arthur Ross Silver Medallion and the 2010 Gravemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Very impressive, because that comes with a very significant monetary award, and if you'd like to fund anything here at SIS, we'd be delighted to discuss endowments.
Never miss an opportunity for fundraising.
After the founder. No, congratulations. Those are two really major awards. Michael Singh, who'll be joining us shortly, is Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he conducts policy research and participates in the public debate over the direction and content of U.S. Middle East policy, former Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council, former Director for Iran and for Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Dr. Natan Sachs is Foreign Policy Fellow in the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, where he researches Israeli foreign policy, Israeli domestic politics, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's been a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford's Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and a former Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia. And Dr. Sharon Weiner is Associate Professor here at SIS. Her recent book, Our Own Worst Enemy, Institutional Interest and the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Expertise, received the National Academy for Public Administration's 2012 Lewis Brownlow Book Award, which is an esteemed book award, but I don't think comes with the same monetary value that the Gravemeyer Award comes from, so we're not going to talk to her about endowing anything. The way we're doing this is I'm going to start with a set of questions, some general questions for the panel, and then some specific questions for some of the specific individuals, and then we will open it up to questions from you. So the first question is, do we know what Iran wants? And when we say, do we know what Iran wants, I suppose we're asking, do we know what particular individuals at the top of the hierarchy in Iran want with respect to nuclear weapons? I mean, is this a case of a country that's determined to get the bomb, determined to have a capability that would allow it to have the bomb within a short period of time? And as we think about or try to understand what Iran wants, how do we know? Trita, you want to?
Sure. If I first can make a comment about the jokes. I can't think of a joke about Ahmadinejad and Netanyahu either. But there is a lot of jokes in Israel about Iranians, called the Parsi jokes. And my last name is Parsi. When I was first time in Israel, everyone insisted on telling me a Parsi joke. I can't for the love of me not remember a single one of them right now for this moment. And in Iran, there's a lot of jokes about Jews as well. What's fascinating is that both the jokes about the Iranians and the jokes about Jews in Iran are all centered on accusing the other of being very cheap, being very stingy. And in fact, when you take a look at it, there's a tremendous amount of similarities culturally and historically, of course, between the two peoples that unfortunately tends to be lost in the current debate that is only centered on this enmity that oftentimes gives the impression that this enmity is yet another one of these ancient historical enmities, whereas in reality is a very modern phenomenon. Historically, the relationships between the two peoples has been tremendously positive by and large, dating back all the way to the early, the Persian king's liberation of the Jewish people from the Babylonian imprisonment. Now, fast forward 2,500 years, and we have a situation with the question as to what is it that Iran really wants. And here I think it's very important to note that there is a tremendous discrepancy between the discourse that we have in the media, in the public, in which the term Iran's nuclear weapons program is the most commonly used term, and the conversation that is taking place in the intelligence community and their assessment, as well as incidentally in the intelligence community in Israel, in which there's quite a different assessment, not necessarily a better one or worse one, but it's just a little bit more nuanced than the rather dark black and white type of a description that we tend to see in the media. I am of the view, which incidentally happens to be the view of the US intelligence as well, that by and large the Iranian program is a continuation of the program that the Shah put in place in the 1970s or actually late 1960s. He did so with the intent, very clearly, to make sure that he was on the verge of having a nuclear weapon. He had not made a decision to build it, but he wanted to make sure that he had the option if things in the region turned negatively. And the primary concern that he had was some of the Arab states, particularly Iraq, but also the Soviet Union, because the Americans had made it very, very clear to the Shah that the United States would not risk a war with the Soviet Union over Iran. And as a result, Iran was not protected in the way that, for instance, Turkey was during the Cold War. The program of the current regime seems to follow that by and large. It was paused for a couple of years and then restarted again in the late 1980s. And what we also know now as to why the Iranians restarted it is actually had nothing to do, and in my own research and interviews with Iranian officials, I saw no evidence that the Israeli nuclear arsenal would have been a motivating factor for the Iranian one. On the contrary, what the Iranians were focused on at the end of the Iraq-Iran war was that both sides at that moment believed that the truce between Iraq and Iran was not sustainable. And at some point, the war would begin very soon. And both sides believed that the other side, at the earliest phase of that war, would use weapons of mass destruction because neither side could afford another 8-year-long war with 1 million casualties. And we know also afterwards that in the interviews with Saddam Hussein, his thinking was also much more focused on Iran than on the US or on Israel. Part of the reason why he still pretended as if he had something, whereas the IAEA was indicating that he didn't in the late 1990s, was because he didn't want the Iranians to think that he didn't have anything because of what it could do in that relationship. I think the Iranians right now continue on that path. They want to be on the verge of being able to have a nuclear weapon, but they also are quite aware that there are some significant strategic negatives for them if they actually move forward and weaponize. They're trying to do what the Shah did, which in some ways is having your cake and eat it too. Have all the capabilities in place, but by refraining from taking the last step until the moment you have to, you avoid all of the negatives. And there's plenty of negatives if you actually build a nuclear weapon as an NPT member state. All of that has, of course, become quite complicated because of the current negotiations, because the many sanctions that have been imposed and the Iranian response to the sanctions, the Iranian pressure point against the US, against the pressure from the international community, is to play with the variable of A, how much transparency or lack of transparency do they have in their program, and B, how much further are they willing to take it? What new facts on the ground are they willing to create in order to improve their negotiating position? I would make the argument that I think the Iranian nuclear program in some ways is more advanced now than the Iranians intended for it to be, as a result of the dynamic between the United States and Iran that is less focused on them actually getting the capability, more focused on them seeing what kind of additional leverage points they can gain. I'll stop there.
Anyone wish to either add or disagree or?
I just say that it is very true that the Israeli intelligence community is not sure that Iran is going to make the final step. But the interesting thing is that within the Israeli assessments, there is little difference, in fact. The Israelis, unlike the Americans, do not think that intelligence-wise it will be simple to tell if that final decision is ever made. And so Iran, on the verge of a bomb from the Israeli perspective, is almost the same. It's not quite the same, but it is almost the same as a nuclear Iran. They, unlike what the President of the United States has said, the Israelis do not think that with a high degree of certitude, they or the Americans will be able to identify that moment. Netanyahu spoke about this in the United Nations, for example. And this means that, of course, the questions of intentions is very important, but to a certain degree from the Israeli intelligence perspective, it's the secondary question. The first question is the actions, and the actions seem to suggest a rapid advancement towards nuclear weapon capability, whether or not the final step is actually taken.
And Natan, if I could just follow up, and welcome to Michael. We're glad to have you here. We'll bring in this conversation in a moment. But you just described what you've articulated as a common assessment within Israel about the direction in which Iran is going. And yet there's a great, or at least there seems from the reading of the press here, a great divergence of opinion within Israel about what to do about that. Can you say a little bit more about the differences of opinion within Israel about how to deal with the question?
Certainly. There's a lot of drama around this in Israel, and especially even the last 2 weeks have been very dramatic domestically inside Israel, partly because the election's coming up, and so censorship becomes more lax. There is very strong disagreement between different figures inside the Israeli establishment, between the prime minister in particular, and until recently the defense minister Barak, and others within his cabinet, right and left, or there are no left, but more hawkish, more dovish in his cabinet. Certainly among the center and the left and the opposition, and even within the security establishment. But I think it's very important to understand the baseline. The disagreement does not sound familiar to disagreements you might hear at this table. There is no doubt among any of the major actors inside Israel that Iran is dramatically advancing a nuclear program, that a nuclear Iran would be terrible for the region and for Israel. It may not be worse than some of the alternatives that are suggested. Some people think Israel might have to live with this terrible consequence. But even those who do, certainly former Mossad head Dagan, former Shabak head Yuval Diskin, and many others, Gabi Ashkenazi, none of them would suggest that the prospect of a nuclear-capable Iran, whether they actually build a bomb or just a few months or a year away from it, is in any way not a very grave situation for Israel. So the disagreement is very much on means, as you put it. It's very much on means of how to deal with it. And even there, the idea that a military or other options should be on the table is almost unanimously, universally accepted. But whether or not that should be used in the foreseeable future is highly contentious in Israel. On the gravity of the situation itself and on the interests of Israel, there's actually much less disagreement than you might think. Israelis are very united, both in the deep concern of Iran, of its intentions, of its words, its own rhetorics. They tend to take Iranian words face value, and they say if the Iranians say something, then they probably mean it.
And Michael, when we look at the U.S., does the situation look similar in terms of those in the decision-making in the United States government? Do you think there's general agreement about where Iran is heading and then a difference over the means? And how does that map onto the Israeli debate? And in particular, we saw Prime Minister Netanyahu get out his red magic marker at the United Nations. Can you enlighten us on this whole subject of red lines?
Sure. Let me start off by apologizing for being late. And I do want to, because I was late, I didn't hear the first question, but as many of you know, in Washington, you don't need to hear a question to answer it. So I want to comment. I want to comment also on what Shrita said. It's true that the judgment of the intelligence community here, if you read the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate on Iran, which is available on the internet, you can see that what they say is that Iran is at least leaving open the option to develop a nuclear weapon. But the question, I think, for policymakers, remember, that's an intelligence judgment. An intelligence judgment is, by necessity, methodical, based on the evidence, very technical in nature. And that intelligence judgment is handed to policymakers who then need to make a decision. And I think that to say that Iran is leaving open the option of developing a nuclear weapon, I think for both U.S. and Israeli policymakers is a little bit like saying that a person with a gun pointed at your head is leaving open the option to shoot you. Right? It's not very comforting, and I'll explain why. So what I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was getting at in his UN address is something that is a belief that U.S. policymakers essentially share, that we don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. We don't want to go to war with Iran. And as we look at Iran's progress, there will come a point where Iran reaches a stage in its nuclear development where we no longer have insight into the further steps that it might take towards weaponization. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu drew the red line at, well, once Iran has enough accumulated 20% enriched uranium, which I think most people would say is about 225 kilograms, that's the red line, because once they have that, the further steps are not easy to see and they're not easy to stop. And why is that? Because they could then take this 20% enriched uranium and enrich it in a smaller facility. We wouldn't necessarily see that facility. We wouldn't necessarily detect it. And then we wouldn't necessarily detect the steps afterwards that you would take to get, say, the weapons-grade enriched uranium and put it into a warhead or a missile. Now, you heard from Vice President Biden during the vice presidential debate a different take on this, which is that until essentially we see that Iran has a usable warhead of some kind, that it has a missile that it can fire at us, we're not concerned. I'm not sure that, frankly, and if you look at that red line versus the Netanyahu red line, there's a huge gulf in between those two. I'm not sure that what Vice President Biden said actually represents the thinking of the administration. But I think it does suggest that they don't share Prime Minister Netanyahu's red line, because if they did, he probably would have said so, or something like that. I think their view is, no, in fact, we could probably let Iran get farther along than Netanyahu suggested, but just how much farther is not clear. And so I think both the U.S. and Israel look at this as something where time is running out for the diplomatic option. Time is running out for sanctions. There's hope, I think, that's reflected in U.S. officials' comments that maybe sanctions will work, but not hope that we have a lot of time to see if that's the case, if you know what I mean. I want to get to the question, too, of why is Iran doing this, because I think it is important for U.S. policymakers to step back and think about this. And I think that we have to start by saying there are good reasons for the Iranian regime to be pursuing nuclear weapons, at least from the Iranian perspective. That doesn't mean we want them to get nuclear weapons so that we can accept it. But if we look at it through their eyes, I think we can see a couple of different reasons. And I think we have to keep in mind that this regime is struggling to survive, in a sense, internally, domestically. And it's struggling to survive in part because the legitimacy of the regime as seen from inside is waning. That revolutionary fervor, that buy-in to the Khomeiniist system, which started in 1979, is declining. And the nuclear weapons program is something which appeals both to sort of, I think, the traditional Persian way, Persian nationalism, the view that Iran should be amongst the world's top powers, that if other countries in the world, such as India and Pakistan, have this, then so should they. But it also appeals to the regime's desire to survive, because having a nuclear weapon would suddenly give other countries in the region and in the world a vested interest in the stability of this regime. Just as we saw when Kim Jong-il died in North Korea, you had a lot of Western powers saying, let's not rock the boat because we don't want nuclear weapons to fall into the hands of some unknown party. Suddenly the West has a vested interest in the regime surviving. And so I think for them it's a win-win, both domestically and in terms of their international standing.
Great. And Sharon, one of the issues that's been discussed as a reason to prevent Iran from going forward with a nuclear weapons program is the impact this could have on proliferation throughout the region. How worried should we be about other countries in the region seeking their own nuclear weapons program based on what Iran does with its program?
Before I go to the proliferation question, I just wanted to briefly say this notion of what Iran has or doesn't have, what they can do or can't do. The indeterminacy, if you will, comes down even to the technical issues. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is responsible for monitoring Iran's compliance with IAEA protocols inspecting its nuclear facilities, they've concluded that they can't conclude whether or not Iran has a nuclear weapons program or a peaceful program. And there's actually a good reason for that, and that's because the relationship between what you need for a nuclear energy program and a nuclear weapons program is very similar. And the difference until the very end is one of political intent. And so that gets at the answer to your question about proliferation, which is one of political intent. Right now, who else in the Middle East besides Israel has nuclear weapons or could easily make them? The first place you start to look is who has a robust nuclear power program. We know that political intentions, Egypt, Turkey, and certainly Saudi Arabia have indicated that they would be uncomfortable with an Iranian nuclear weapons program, that they would see this as a threat in some way. But none of those countries has the infrastructure in the near term to make anything close to resembling a nuclear weapon. So this is a long-term process, and in that long term, that gives space for discussions about a nuclear weapons-free zone, removing nuclear weapons from both Iran and Israel, and other confidence-building measures so that states wouldn't feel they needed nuclear weapons for their survival.
So since you've raised this issue of a nuclear-free zone, I want to get a sense from Trita and from Natan about within each respective country. I mean, within Israel, how much discussion is there about Israel's willingness to give up its nuclear weapons? I guess it would first have to acknowledge that it has them, and then it would give them up. And Trita, is this something we just heard Michael say that the pursuit of a nuclear weapons program is helpful domestically for the leadership within Iran. So how difficult would it be for Iran to agree to such a thing in terms of the domestic politics? Or another way of putting that, how popular is the pursuit of nuclear weapons in Iran?
Well, I'd say that there is some debate in Israel. It's not very large about the policy of ambiguity, of the idea of hinting and winking at the world that possibly Israel has strategic capabilities, or the phrase in the Israeli press is always, according to foreign press, Israel has nuclear weapons. And often whenever an Israeli journalist wants to write something about this, they will call their buddy in the Frankfurter Allgemeine and they will tell them something, and then they will say, according to foreign press, this is what happens. And they'll be the first to say it. That is a debate. But given the assumption that Israel has nuclear capabilities, there's almost no support in Israel for disarmament. And almost none. I don't know of a recent poll done, and partly because it's not a very interesting polling question. The reason for this is twofold. First, like Michael said about Iran, the Israeli rationale for having the ultimate defense, it's actually a very bad kind of offensive weapon in many respects, but as a defensive weapon, it is the ultimate defense. And many aspects of it, including reportedly building up the naval capabilities for second strike option, are very central to the Israeli national security understanding. And this is true right and left, irrespective of any positions on the Palestinian question or any other kind of question. It's easy to forget. There's a lot of rhetoric about it, and it can sound like propaganda sometimes, but it's easy to forget that the sense of threat that Israelis feel is very real, and moreover, it's not absurd. It is a very small country in a region that is very hostile. And so even those who are very opposed to unilateral Israeli strike in Iran, who would be very leftist on Palestinian questions, would be very hesitant to ever agree to disarmament. The second aspect of this, the reason this is sort of a non-starter in Israel, is that there's just no belief that they could ever trust that not just the Islamic Republic of Iran, or if it changed and become a country that Israel might not mind even as a nuclear power, such as the Shah's Iran or democratic Iran. But there are so many other actors around, even actors that are somewhat friendly, even allies of the United States, such as Saudi Arabia, which may build a bomb down the road or may buy one from Pakistan. The Israeli fear of this is so deep, and it touches on the most fundamental aspects of Israeli national security that I would say it almost comes before even alliance with the United States and consideration of international relations. Don't forget, the Israeli nuclear program predates the very close security relationship with the United States. It is a very fundamental sort of aspect of the way Israelis perceive a doomsday defense.
I'm going to have to take a couple of steps back because you asked the question, how popular is the nuclear weapons program? Going back to what I said earlier on, it is the estimate of the U.S. intelligence. See the testimony of Clapper in the U.S. Senate, I think it was in January of this year, in which he said that it has, with high confidence, the belief that the Iranians currently do not have a weapons program. He was asked again to clarify, and he said with high confidence, it doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. So the analogy that Michael used is saying that, they're holding a gun, will they or will they not shoot? They're not holding a gun. They don't have a gun, And there's a high confidence of intelligence in the United States that says they're not currently building a gun. They can, and it's a problem, and we have to figure out a way to make sure that doesn't happen. But it's important to also understand what actually exists and what doesn't, because bringing ourselves into a hysterical level of a discourse only reduces the good options that exist in front of us. So then, going to your question, is there support for the nuclear program? And to what extent could the regime domestically face trouble if it compromises it? I think the nuclear program that they have right now is not one, or let me put it this way. For them to get a nuclear weapon does not in any way, shape, or form change the fundamental problem that this regime has with the Iranian people, which is that this is a regime that has failed its people on almost every level. This is a country that could be far more advanced than it currently is. It could be far more free than it currently is. It has the resources, the human capital base to be able to be a very modern, effective country. But mainly because of the political system, the political repression, they are not where they should be. Their potential is far beyond where they currently are. The regime has failed them. It has not proven itself to be competent. And having a nuclear weapon or not does not change that in the slightest. Back in the 1970s in Iran, there was a debate as to whether the opposition should support the Shah buying American jets, and the Shah was buying American weapons left and right, arguing that if he has these weapons, he will be able to be protected from his own people and there won't be regime change. Well, it turned out to be an utterly false argument. Having those jets or not having those jets did not make any difference. When the population rose up and demanded a change, they got it, whether he had those weapons or not. So I don't believe the regime itself, in any way, shape, or form, believes that the weapons option is a protection against its own people. That's now how you can use this leverage. If anything, it is based on the security threats that they perceive in the region, and then it is primarily the threat that they perceive from the United States. Michael mentioned that they would see a lot of benefits. I don't think necessarily that they view it that way. Going back all the way to the time of the Shah, part of the reason why this is a program in which they wanted to be on the verge of having it, but not actually passing that line unless it was absolutely necessary, is because of the strategic negatives that Iran would face. And what are those strategic negatives? Well, you have to put yourself in the shoes of not only this regime, but the previous regime, of saying, okay, how do they see themselves and what are their objectives? One of the key objectives of this regime, as well as the previous one, is to be recognized as a major power in the region. To be able to achieve that, they need both a combination of hard power, but also a lot of soft power and essential acceptance by other regional states. They cannot lead a region if the other regional states reject their leadership. In order to achieve that, they had to balance making sure they're not perceived as a threat, because the more its Arab surrounding perceives Iran as a threat, the more it arms itself, buying American weapons and inviting extra-regional powers to have a military presence in the region. Moreover, the reason why the Iranians believe that they have this natural position of being a leader is because of their conventional superiority. Because it is one of the largest countries in the region, has one of the most expansive, diverse sets of natural resources, as well as tremendously valuable human capital. And as a result of that, for the last 2,000 years, Iran has oftentimes played a leadership role. If, however, Iran were to build a weapon, precisely the same arguments that is used against, in favor of making sure that they don't build it from the outside, there is a risk that there will be proliferation in the region. And then even smaller states, much, much smaller states, such as theoretically a Bahrain, a country that is not even a 40th of Iran's size, population-wise or geographically, could also then choose to either buy or build a weapon. And what then happens? Well, then Iran loses its strategic superiority. It would actually be at strategic parity with these small states, who also would then be able to destroy Iran. And Iran would essentially have undermined its own basis, its own justification for playing a leadership role in the region. An Israeli general actually explained this to me very well a couple of years ago while I was interviewing him in Israel. And he said, the Iranians are clever enough not to make the mistake that India made. India was 10 times the size of Pakistan until it tested the bomb. Then it tested the bomb, Pakistan tested the bomb, and suddenly they were equals. They were at strategic parity because both of them could destroy each other. This is not a surprise or a mystery to the Iranians. You can find it in the secret documents of the regime itself, the previous regime, and you can hear it from current regime officials as well. This is not an argument to say that there isn't significant concern for what the Iranians are doing. This is not an argument to say that anyone should pull down their guard. But you can't resolve a problem if you have a fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the problem. If you're making assumptions about the other side that only hold on paper but cannot be tested in reality or have actually been proven to be false in reality. This is a much more sophisticated, complex calculation on the Iranian side. It is not a dash towards a bomb. The Pakistanis built a bomb in 9.5 years from scratch. That's a rush towards a bomb. The Iranians have been having this program now since the end of 1980s, and they still don't have a weapon. It's certainly progressing. It certainly is concerning, but to call this some sort of a rush towards a bomb, I think is, again, not necessarily compatible with the facts. Again, I want to emphasize, this is not an argument not to take this seriously. This is not an argument to say, hey, it wouldn't matter if Iran would get to a nuclear bomb. It actually would. It would be a very big negative, and I would make the argument it would primarily be a negative for the Iranians themselves. To be able to figure out how to prevent that, we have to have a decent and smart combination of an understanding of how we can utilize the supply side as well as the demand side of this equation. The supply side is to make sure they don't have access to the material. Is to make sure that they don't have the various things that many of these sanctions now apparently have prevent them from getting access to. The demand side is even more important because that is to make sure that we utilize whatever incentives they themselves have for not building the bomb, making sure that the demand for a nuclear bomb in Iran is as weak as possible. It's part of the reason I think the Bush administration strategy was not particularly effective, because the more there is an emphasis that the military option is on the table, the more there is an emphasis that we may just use our military preemptively, preventively, etc., the more you actually increase the desire on the other side to quickly get a nuclear deterrence so that the United States or Israel cannot do this. We have to have a good grasp of both sides of this equation in order to succeed with this issue.
And just going to ask one more question of Michael and Sharon, and then, because we have so many of you here, we'll open it up to you all. The question of this, U.S. military option on the table, and when the United States might really confront a decision about whether to strike Iran, whether that's because of a sense that Israel might be striking, or whether the United States makes its own calculation that it needs to do something in order to prevent the actual development of a nuclear weapons capability. There was some thought in the Bush years that the George W. Bush administration would really confront this decision. There was a lot of thought in the first Obama term that the Obama administration was really going to have to make this decision. It seems hard to imagine that we get through another 4 years of President Obama without really confronting this decision. But I don't know. Maybe we just keep going along as we're going along. But what will be the trigger, if you will, for such a decision? Can we continue to go on from administration to administration using sanctions, or because Iran is not in a rush, as Trita was just suggesting? Or do you think that, in fact, President Obama in this second term is really going to have to confront this major decision about striking or not striking?
Well, I want to first just briefly respond to what Trita said, because Trita made a very brave defense of the regime's actions, but to me it just doesn't add up. So you need three things for a nuclear weapons program. You need nuclear fuel by enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium. You need to be able to weaponize, quote unquote, weaponize that fuel by taking it and making it into the right shape and configuration for a warhead. And you need a missile or a delivery system to get the weapon from here to there. Well, Iran obviously has made tremendous progress in terms of enriching. It has a couple of enrichment facilities, one of which was covert until it was revealed by the West. That facility, the IAEA said, had no real possible civilian purpose because of its size, configuration, happens to be under the control of the IRGC and have lots of air defenses around it. They've enriched to 20%, which they say is for medical isotopes, but the fact is they've made far more of this 20% enriched uranium than they would need for quite a long time to make medical isotopes. And they've talked now about increasing to 60%, which you could, either it would be for a nuclear weapon or maybe for nuclear subs, which is what they've said. In terms of weaponization, they've done extensive weaponization R&D, probably as much as they need to make a weapon. So again, all detailed in the IEA's reports. And in terms of missiles, look, they have the most advanced missile program of any country that's not a nuclear state. At the same time, they've done all of this while paying a tremendous price for their activities. This is a country which used to export 6 million barrels of oil a day before the Islamic regime came into power. As recently as a couple years ago, exported 2.2 million barrels a day. Now exports 866,000 barrels of oil a day. It's come under tremendous sanctions. People can't travel. It's not developing in the way that it should, as Trita said. So it's paying all this price for this nuclear program, which Trita and the regime have said is just peaceful, which to me suggests either that, in fact, it's not peaceful and that they want a nuclear weapon, they view that nuclear weapon as worth paying this tremendous price, or, in fact, you have a very confused regime, which is bad at making decisions. Now, Trita said that, well, if they got a nuclear weapon, they would have to pay this price in terms of their oil exports, their soft power. In fact, they're paying that price now to have this program. And the reason they're paying that price, look, logically, here we are at a university. Why are they doing all this? Occam's razor suggests it's because, in fact, they want a nuclear weapon. Now, they have moved very slowly, and I think the regime has been careful to avoid doing anything that would provoke a Western strike, and so far has been largely successful. And when they felt they had to, from my point of view and from the intelligence community's conclusions, they've suspended some of that work, including in 2003, because they worried that, in fact, they were going to provoke a strike. They have a challenge now, a real obstacle, which is how do they get from where they are now to having, say, weapons-grade enriched uranium or an actual nuclear weapon without provoking a strike? And so they need to find ways to degrade either the access of inspectors or to secretly make the 20% enriched uranium into 90% enriched uranium. And I think this has to govern this conversation of red lines. The policy in the Bush administration, as it has been in the Obama administration, is to both avoid a nuclear-armed Iran and to avoid a war with Iran, to use a combination of sanctions, diplomacy, and military threats to try to dissuade Iran from continuing down the path it's on. That largely hasn't worked because Iran has tremendously expanded its nuclear program. But I think now as we think about red lines and where do we have to stop this policy, how long can we let it go, as you suggested, I think the question is when must we stop? Because I don't think we will move to a, say, military posture until we absolutely have to, and I think this goes for the Israelis as well. And so you look at things at, like, when they have enriched uranium to a certain level or accumulated a certain amount. And I think experts would disagree over what the right stage of your enrichment is at which to form a red line. But other things like kicking out inspectors or even decreasing the access of inspectors short of kicking them out, so that you can no longer be sure what the status of the nuclear program is. Doing other things, like purchasing some kind of nuclear material from North Korea, for example. There's different red lines you could have, at which point I think you'd need to consider using military force. But I think that rightly the Obama administration has made military force a last resort while saying, look, ultimately we're going to use it if we have to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And I expect that, look, if we can get through 4 more years of delay and avoiding this coming to a head in terms of a military confrontation, that's probably what both the U.S. and Israel would prefer to do.
Mm-hmm. Sharon?
Can I just
Wait,
give
hold
a
on.
quick
Let
response?
me
No,
get to
hold
Sharon.
on. Not your turn. You can look at what Iran's doing right now, and you can come to one of 2 conclusions. One, as Michael suggested, is they're pursuing a nuclear weapons capability, which indeed what they're doing is consistent with that. It's also consistent with something else. It's consistent with a state that feels like it's been marginalized under international rules and regimes, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which tell it actually can do the very things it's doing as long as they're for peaceful purposes. The only difference about Iran and other countries that have done this is Iran got into this kerfluffle with the great powers in the United States in 1979 that's created a whole other host of suspicions and other issues, and that what Iran is doing is not particularly different from what many other states have done when they're pursuing nuclear power and other capabilities. It's allowed under the NPT. The NPT says not only that you're allowed to pursue peaceful purposes of nuclear energy, but that other states have a responsibility to help you do that as long as you forswear weapons capabilities. Now, do I think Iran's pursuing a nuclear weapon? I have no idea. I know if I was in Iran's position, given the international system and the power of the United States and my lack of power, I would be pursuing a nuclear weapon. So therefore, I have to assume that it's at least interesting to them to do so. But to say that the things they're doing necessarily suggest that they're absolutely doing that with no other explanation isn't accurate. In response to the question of what the Iranians themselves want, and Trita, I thought you might mention the people poll that was conducted at the University of Maryland. The extensive polling in Iran suggests that what Iranians want overwhelmingly is the capacity to someday have a nuclear weapon. But the decision right now is no, we think it's wrong to have a nuclear weapon. That's not the sort of power Iran wants to have in the international system. In terms of the Bush administration and the Obama administration, I think they both came to actually a red line decision a long time ago, and it's the same decision. Using nuclear force to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon is bad. It's bad for the United States, it's bad for the region, it's bad for Iran, it's bad for Israel. It would set back Iranian nuclear capabilities, their ability to pursue a nuclear weapon, by at most, I think the estimates are at most 4 years. And it would really piss Iran off. And if they don't want a weapon now, they most certainly would after a military strike.
You wanted to
Sure.
say one final thing before we open it up?
Just a couple of brief things. Michael, I think your debate is not with me, it's with Clapper. This is his testimony. What he's saying is not consistent with what you said here. And I think it is somewhat indicative that when we are trying to have a more elevated conversation and trying to understand the perspective of all sides in order to be able to figure out the best policy route, it is utterly self-destructive to say that anyone who adds a different perspective or who adds more nuance to the rather simplistic explanation you have of Iranian calculations, that is a defense of the regime. We're at a university right now. We're not at one of the think tanks in which that type of argument flies. We have to have the type of in-depth conversation about this in order to make sure that we don't have another one of those 8 years of the Bush administration in which this problem only got worse, or the last 4 years, and unfortunately we haven't seen the progress that was promised, and I think that is still achievable. Reducing this debate about this very severe problem into simple sound bites, eliminating all nuance, is a recipe for the very same disaster you say you want to avoid. And I think it would be better for everyone to make sure that we take a step back, recognize we've not been particularly successful on this. Why is that? How can we get out of it? And I have one suggestion. I think in some of the reasonings you see both on the Iranian side and on the American side is that there is an assumption that we have turned into a conclusion about what exactly is it that the other side is trying to do. And then every new piece of information we interpret to be able to fit that larger grand scheme that we think that the other side has been engaged in for the last 15, 20 years. This ingenious plan that they have that they never deviate from. The Iranian grand scheme of what the US is doing is that everything the US does is aimed at regime change. If the US imposes sanctions, threatens war, or if Obama extends a hand of friendship, that clearly is just the latest variation of how you want to do regime change. Because the American grand scheme of doing that is just so amazingly perfect. So everything is interpreted within that lens. Anything that doesn't fit that lens, we dismiss, we ignore, or we actually attack and say, well, it's even heretic to even consider any other explanation. On this side, we have a different variation, and that is that everything that happens is a devious, very well thought through plan, put together 40 years ago by Khomeini to be able to get a nuclear bomb. Everything that happens is interpreted in that sense, rather than to recognize that there may be several different explanations as to why the Iranians are doing X, Y, and Z. And we refuse to take in that information. Instead, we're constantly perpetuating, both sides, this belief that the other side has this grand scheme and they're just following it. Having had an opportunity to see a little bit how things work in the US government. I used to work for the Swedish government before, and I know Michael would be able to testify to this. There's no such thing in governments, particularly on foreign policy, that can get anywhere close to a grand scheme. Things are chaotic. Most things are determined because they're overtaken by events. And if you actually are lucky enough to be able to pursue a strategy for a couple of years, I mean, you really deserve a medal. But in this fast-changing world, it's not that. Most of the things that happen is a combination of correcting the mistakes and just being tactical all the time. And to make the argument that either the US or Iran has had this large scheme is actually the conspiracy that I think we have to walk away from.